Is taking again advantage of the fact that it's able to use assets again, tankers, other sorts of vessels, as well as small drones, some larger drones that our defenses are not set up even to look for, because it's not the kind of threat that defense planning really has been focused on.
Let's look at the security of the country then. On the front page of the Times this morning, British military bases are going to be beefed up with counter-drone weapons. This is because of concerns about Russian spying. £750 million are going to be spent on short-range drone protection for Homeland Defence and deployed forces. Details have very recently emerged after the Kremlin was suspected of a drone campaign which left a British pilot fearing for his life in a near collision 18 months ago in Suffolk, flying over RAF Lakenheath. Well, let's talk to Sam Greene, Professor in Russian Politics at King's College London. Good morning, Sam.
Morning.
It is quite shocking to hear that drones have been launched and controlled by a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker that's docked in Hull, that can have serious safety implications for those pilots we've just heard about flying above Suffolk.
Well, I think that's certainly true. It's jarring. It's something, obviously, that defense authorities and analysts have been paying attention to and calling for more attention to for some time. But it's part of a pattern of activity, drone flights, other sorts of sabotage and infiltration that the Russians have been perpetrating in the UK, elsewhere in Europe now, really throughout the time of the war in Ukraine, both as a means of reconnaissance and surveillance, as well as a means of deterrence. It's meant to make it difficult for policymakers and the general public here to understand the level of the threat that they face and to worry about the decisions that they make when it comes to confronting Russia and Ukraine and beyond.
Do you think that threat is fully understood?
I think it's certainly more fully understood than it was even just a couple of years ago, as people have begun to join the dots of this, the kinds of activity that Russia has been engaging in, as well as to understand what this activity is designed to do. It's designed to operate just under the threshold of what we would usually think about as war, to make it difficult for policymakers to understand whether there was an attack, whether this attack constitutes a threat to national security and not simply some kind of essentially state-sponsored hooliganism. And whether it requires us a national security response. That conversation now is happening at the NATO level, at the European level, at the Allied level, in ways that at least make it possible for there to be a consolidated, joined-up response that makes it more difficult for Russia to perpetrate this kind of activity.
Yeah, but I mean, having shadow vessels in the North Sea near Essex means Russia were able, it looks like, in for various instances in November in 2024, fly drones over military bases. And last year, Sam, we learned there were more than 250 drone incidents near UK military sites. This actually suggests a campaign that is ramping up.
It does, and it is taking again advantage of the fact that it's able to use assets again, tankers, other sorts of vessels, as well as small drones, some larger drones that our defenses are not set up even to look for, because it's not the kind of threat that defense planning really has been focused on. Defense planning has been focused on military operations by military assets, and that is not the way that Russia has been doing. This is not entirely the way that Russia has been fighting the war in Ukraine, and so as Britain and other countries gear up for what the future of war, including the future of defense and deterrence against Russia, might look like, it is having to rethink its entire surveillance and reconnaissance system, its entire system of threat perception. It's not alone in having to do this. The entirety of Europe is having to do this, but it is a significant challenge.
Yeah, it's not just warfare with drones, is it? It's cyber attacks. It is even the arson attack on the Prime Minister's home that we heard about in the last year or so. The cyber attacks, I mean, one thing we're looking at is what happened at Jaguar Land Rover. There could have been Russian involvement there. Just how pervasive is this threat? That's sort of not the one we can physically see in terms of the drones.
Well, what's pervasive certainly is the vulnerability. Again, we've learned to harden systems against cyber attacks, but when you're dealing with a concerted and well-resourced adversary like a state, like the Russian state in particular, it is hard to defend everything against everything all of the time, and that is something again the Russians are able to exploit. I think that the danger isn't so much that this is a precursor to an immediate invasion, although that's something defense planners obviously have to take seriously. It's that something inadvertently goes wrong. Right? This is meant to be a nuisance. This is meant from the Russian side to make it difficult again for Britain and its allies to plan and to respond and to pursue their own interests when it comes to Russia, to Ukraine and beyond. But what it has the opportunity to do is accidentally to cause real damage. Right? So you could imagine that a healthcare system goes down, or a critical energy system goes down, or that one of these drones strays into civilian airspace and accidentally collides with a civilian jetliner, and you lose 200-300 civilian lives in British territory, on NATO territory, and that requires then an escalational response that gets both sides in a war that nobody wants. And so I think that the question that policymakers are asking is, how do we get Russia to stop doing this? How do we begin to communicate that there is consequence to doing this, and that's a consequence that the Russians may not want to bear and thus have to take seriously.
And what are the solutions, the ideas to do that?
Well, I think what everybody's realizing is that the current solutions, mostly naming and shaming and some sanctions activity, clearly don't work because they attack assets that the Russians really don't take terribly seriously. So what people are looking at is what would a kinetic response look like, right? Shooting down some of these drones, perhaps. The Poles have done that. We've also seen that the Swedes, for example, have begun to, and the French have begun, and in fact the British have begun more recently to board and seize Shadow Fleet vessels, which pushes them farther away from territorial waters, and this makes it harder for these drones to get involved. I know that NATO defense planners are looking at more costly activity that can impose consequence on Russia itself as a state, but they're being very coy about exactly what that might look like.
It's been fascinating. Thank you. Sam Greene, Professor of Russian Politics at King's College London. That interview, Calum, has reminded me of a conversation we had with John Healey a few months ago now, after Russia, before the British military started the policy of stepping on seizing Russian Shadow Fleet vessels. John Healey, do you remember, he came on the programme and he said, "Russia, we see you. Russia, we see you." And that was met by sort of just total sort of outrage on messages here. People thought, what on earth is that that's doing absolutely nothing, as Sam just demonstrated there, to say you have to change tack, calling it out and saying, "Russia, we know it's you," seemed to achieve very little, which you may have thought, well, that was going to be obvious.
Yeah, this sort of strategy around this, when we say that these sorts of actions are a threat and a provocation, well, what are they provoking? what should we be doing? What is the correct response? And all of it is such a sort of strategic game of chess, to use a cliche. We're never quite sure that the action taken in response is assertive enough, actually, in that sort of context.